Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining virtually this conference on collective intelligence to talk to you about experts versus ordinary citizens in the French Convention on Climate Change. So, in the fall of 2019, last year, the French government convened an assembly of 150 randomly selected citizens to debate and deliberate about ways to reduce French green gas emissions by 40% of the 1990s levels in a spirit of social justice. The convention was convened for 6 weekends that turned into 7 by the end of the process. This convention survived massive social protests and a pandemic, and will gather physically for the last time this coming weekend, on June 19th to June 21st, to render its conclusions and proposals to the government. Obviously, how to reduce green gas emissions in a spirit of social justice is a very difficult question, rendered in this particular case all the more technical by the fact that President Macron made it clear he wanted the citizens to deliver law-like proposals that he could submit, I quote, without filter, in his own words, to a referendum, direct regulation, or parliamentary debate. This meant that, in effect, the ordinary citizens were asked to be competent not only in the substance, a very complicated topic of climate change, but also on the best way to translate and transcribe their ideas into a legalistic format. Obviously, ordinary citizens cannot do that on their own, and they need experts' help. Unlike the great national debate, which was a free-for-all kind of nationwide conversation about 4 general topics, the Convention on Climate Change involved a lot of experts in a way that went beyond the cases I'm aware of. For example, we know James Fishkin's deliberative polls include experts, but they include them as outside speakers intervening on panels at a distance from the members of the deliberative polls. Similarly, in the Irish case of the 2016 Citizens' Assembly on abortion, the experts came in as outside speakers without mingling with the participants to the degree that they did in the French Convention. So the question for us today is this: can ordinary citizens avail themselves of experts' help and work with them as closely as they did in the French Convention on Climate Change without surrendering sovereignty over the laws to experts, and in fact, without being captured by them? It's a constant worry and a constant critic of this kind of setup, that there's the danger that the clueless citizens are going to be captured by more informed parties. In other words, can the collective intelligence of citizens be augmented with experts' knowledge, as it needs to on technical issues, without the experts taking over entirely? I think there are some lessons that we can derive from the French Convention on Climate Change in that respect. The good news is that ordinary citizens can be lawmakers, after all, not just agenda setters when they are properly helped with experts. That came to me as a surprise because in my own previous research, I had envisioned a role for ordinary citizens that was that of generalist agenda setters, not actual legislators. And this Convention on Climate Change has convinced me that actually, with the proper help, they can become very, very close to actual legislators. The bad news is that it's very hard, time-consuming, painstaking, at times aggravating to work out a functional relationship between citizens that keeps, between citizens and experts, that keep each of these categories in their proper place. And for me, that would be citizens on top and experts on top. Why do citizens need to stay on top, you might ask? We could imagine a different setup where actually the experts are the decision makers and they consult ordinary citizens. I think citizens need to remain on top because, as the theory of collective intelligence predicts, and the practice in that case, in the case of the French Convention, completely verified, the diversity of thinking present in the group of citizens plays an essential role in reopening the conceptual boxes constantly closed by the experts. Citizens' presence prevents the closure of the conversation to areas that the experts are familiar with. To use a topographic metaphor, citizens will keep wandering in all kinds of directions, allowing them to explore the solution map outside the perimeter narrowly defined by experts. In that way, the group will cover a lot more of the possible landscape than they would if they just search for solutions where experts are used to looking for them. And this collective intelligence phenomenon can only happen if citizens are positioned as the drivers of the deliberation and the ultimate decision makers, and if experts are subordinated to them and at their service. So let me now illustrate this with a couple of examples from the Citizens Convention on Climate Change. But first, let me define what I mean by an expert. So I define experts as individuals identified as bearers of a certain type of knowledge and expertise through their credentials, reputations, and they are selected as experts to intervene in the convention. By contrast, the citizens are non-experts in the sense that they were chosen on a random basis rather than on the basis of whatever knowledge or expertise they may also happen to have. So the experts in this sense were present among at least 4 groups in the convention. So it was extremely present throughout the process. First, they were heavily present on the governance committee of the 150 ordinary citizens. This governance committee included, for example, 3 climate change experts, 3 citizen participation experts, and various people from the 3rd legislative chamber in France who have some expertise in social and economic topics. The second group of experts included the organizers themselves, meaning the agencies Mission Publique and Res Publica that run a very tight show of plenaries, working groups, speed dating sessions with various speakers, and online webinars over months on the basis of their prudential knowledge and their practice of deliberative assemblies. The third group of experts was the so-called support group, which included academics and government experts put at the service of the citizens, and they were there to answer technical questions, to evaluate the carbon impact of the proposed measures, to provide facts and resources of all kinds. The fourth group finally included the so-called legalistic committee, and that was a group of high-level civil servants in charge of transcribing and translating citizen proposals into official legalese. So all these experts played an enormous role throughout the process. From the beginning, citizens' interactions were, as I said, governed by this group of 15 people at the top. It was micromanaged on the ground by the organizers on a very tight schedule. And the citizens were constantly and heavily lectured at and advised by all kinds of experts. And even with such a sort of very expert-heavy setup, I noticed a change of gear towards the 4th session, between the 4th and 5th sessions, where in fact experts gain even more power in the convention, if you will. They started introducing a level of detail in the text that had been absent so far, down to, for example, the ideal temperature at which washing machines should operate. And this was not necessarily something that the citizens themselves had come up with. Nonetheless, throughout, I also observed a constant pushback from the citizens and a constant and in fact growing assertion of sovereignty over the text and the ideas in the text. So let me show you now how citizens' main virtue, main contribution to collective intelligence in a way is to reopen the boxes constantly closed by the experts. So the first example is from the first session of the convention in October. During a meeting between 5 members of the legalistic committee and the 150 citizens convened in a plenary. One of the members of the legalistic committee, a state councillor, presented a long, pictureless PowerPoint on the hierarchy of norms in French law. It was very technical and frankly a little boring. which was confirmed the following day on the mood boards, where people complained that there's too much expert talk, that the experts speak too fast, that the legal presentation in particular was very difficult. Yet to my surprise, when question time came for the state councillor, the first question was this one. In the table of the hierarchy of norms, you did not note the place of contract. Why is that? I was blown away by the specificity of the question and wondered how the state councillor was going to handle it. So here's how the state councillor replied. And I want you to notice the mid-sentence reversal and the move from a position of confident lecturing to a moment of self-doubt and a concession that the citizen was actually right. So here's the state councillor's answer. I quote, "It was to enlighten you on what you are going to propose. A priori, you are not going to propose contracts. There are two types of contracts, private contracts and public contracts, but it's not in what you are a priori. Well, that said, yes, that's an excellent idea. Contracts are also part of what you could propose. Contracts between private persons on certain matters. You are right. Don't bridle yourselves. You are right." So we see a 100-degree reversal in the expert's position prompted by a single question from an innocent sounding naive citizen. And it opened up a new field of action for the group. A second example came in session 4, just after the the official visit by President Macron. So this was in a subgroup, in a working group focused on housing, the one that I've been following for the last few months, where an expert started lecturing the citizens about the lack of concern for the ways to finance the proposed measures. So she clearly moved from a position of advice to a position of admonishing and passing normative judgments on what the citizens were doing. So I think the fact that this expert crossed the line here was actually instantly picked on by the citizens. So here's what she said to the citizens. "You are calling for a lot of expenses. If your convention makes the French deficit go up to 10% of the GDP, the president will say, 'No, I can't sink France.'" And to this, the citizens reacted very strongly. So one of them immediately said, quite aggressively actually, "I can't believe this. It's your interpretation. Leave the president alone. Who is this lady? Why doesn't she introduce herself? For whom is she working?" So there was immediately a suspicion that she was a kind of lobbyist, or that it was unclear what her motivations were. She lost credibility in that instance. Another citizens immediately chimed in as well, less aggressively. I quote, "I understand we should pay attention to funding, but to focus on that now is a little too quick. We are going to think about it. We will find solutions. Don't hurry us." So again, what you saw here is an expert closing a box too soon. In fact, as demonstrated a few months later by the fact that now the deficit constraint has been thrown out of the window for the pandemic. But not only that, it's also that the box was closed with a sort of normative judgment on top of it that was not seen as legitimate by the citizens. Third example happened very recently during a mandatory webinar that took place on May 31st. That for me is in a way the most crucial example. So the citizens were gathered by the organizers virtually because there was no possibility to meet physically at that point in time to debate the possibility of a referendum on some of their proposals that could legally lend themselves to such a treatment. So the organizers presented a PowerPoint spelling out the options on the basis of what the legalistic committee had recommended, but the legalistic committee was absent. So the organizers was presenting their suggestions. So the possibility of a multi-question referendum comes up in the Zoom chat when a citizen asks, again, a seemingly naive question. "A multiple choice referendum has never been organized in France. Does it have more chances to be accepted?" And the organizer answers that since it has never been organized, the legalistic committee chose not to put this option on the menu because it seemed to them relatively uncertain. So it's a very, very clear-cut example, and in fact, even a shocking example of experts unduly narrowing the perimeter of the possible on something that could be the life or spell out the life or death of some proposals. Because personally, I think that a multiple choice referendum is kind of the only way for some of the measures to be accepted, because in France we have a sort of tradition, and many countries also do, of approaching referenda as a plebiscite on government. If you have only one question, that's how citizens are going to use that. So what was striking to me is that the organizer statement went almost unnoticed for a while, until one of the impartial guarantors who are there to observe and make sure everything goes well and without ethical breaches intervened and said, he said to the organizers, when you say that the legalistic committee sidelined the possibility of a multiple choice referendum, it does not mean that it's not technically possible. It seems to me that it's up to the citizens to decide this, not up to the legalistic committee. To which the organizer answered a bit defensively that, well, I did not say they sidelined it, I just said that they chose not to instruct this hypothesis, which is another way to say that they sidelined it, basically. So, and the guarantor again insisted, it is important to keep this an open hypothesis, and it's up to citizens to decide. So notice that the citizens did reopen that box, right? Somebody put it on the chat and reopened that box. But you see how fragile this reopening can be if experts have too much power. And that's why the presence of the impartial guarantor who picked up on that suggestion and made sure it was on the table and reopened the box helped really strengthen that power of the citizens. So there's a lot more I could say about expert-citizens relationship in this convention, which is fascinating in all kinds of ways. But the main message for my purposes today is this: citizens can be lawmakers, but they can only be so with the help of experts, the heavy involvement of experts. There's no doubt about that. So it is crucial for the collective intelligence of the outputs and the qualities of the laws ultimately generated that the citizens remain on top of experts and experts in turn remain at the service of citizens on tap. The strength of the citizen is to force experts to think out of the box, and they can only do that if they are actually empowered to do so both by the design of the convention and by the presence of strategic agents that support their views, like the guarantors. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.